So this first group of questions is more related to the timeline and the process that we're going through here. So this first one is, how did the process come about? How is it being funded? And how long will it take to be completed? And I know we've hit on that a little bit, but if you all could clarify that.
We all agree that this kind of model was a very effective tool, not only for permitting decisions, but for long-term water planning. And how is it funded? We were fortunate that the legislature gave us $1.5 million to do the modeling and the water assessment, so it is state appropriated dollars.
What is the anticipated date, length of the study to determine the usefulness of the study?
I'm not sure that I can answer that one, really. You want to take a crack at that one, Dave?
Yeah, look, I think the plan is, so the models themselves, the tools would be finished somewhere in the middle of 2016. And then, of course, we have to go through the exercise of using the models, running these scenarios, doing the demand projections, and that sort of thing. So that would be some time out from there. And then that really begins the planning process, the DNR, where the models are used in that planning process. So it'll certainly be, some time period after the models are completed, mid-2016, when they're used, we do the demand projections and see how that turns out and start going through the process.
And just to add to that, what we anticipate completing an update of the statewide water plan is about a 5-year process, and that includes the 2 years here, so 3 more years beyond the end of the actual modeling and assessment.
Okay, another timeline-related question, actually more related to updating the model. Can the model be updated to reflect changes in environmental conditions, number of users, and water quality?
Yes, it can. CDM can give you how that's done if you're interested in that part. But we actually have talked about that and really anticipating that probably every 5 years or so we're going to have to update the information to keep them current over time. But as new users come on and off the system, then the model can be easily updated.
The only other thing I'll add to that is the unimpaired flows every 5 years perhaps would be evaluated again and re-entered into the model to represent the most recent hydrologic trends.
Okay, here are a few questions that are, I think, a little more model specific. And this one is, what other states have used this type of model to modify their water legislation?
John, you can jump in here too. I haven't been involved in a situation where a model like this has modified legislation, but it has been used as part of the statewide and regional planning process in many states. This tool specifically has been used in 4 other states, Texas, and Oklahoma, Colorado, and Arkansas, to develop basin plans, which then get fed up to the state government and are written then into the statewide water plans. I'm not aware of specific instances where legislation was modified, but the process of evaluating water availability and allocation was much better informed as a result of using tools like this.
Okay. In the CDM model, do you use total agricultural registration or actual usage?
The model can be used to evaluate either of those, depending on the scenario and the questions being used. In the calibration model, the model that we use to make sure we're reproducing historical patterns, we will use actual usage to the extent that we can. And that's based on numbers that have been reported or estimated as actual usage. But in future planning scenarios, that number can be changed to represent any value and determine how feasible that value can be.
And I'll point something out that we didn't mention during our discussion. There's a threshold for the amount of withdrawal that we would include in the model. We don't want to provide too much detail in the model such that it becomes unwieldy. So we basically use the same threshold that DHEC uses for their permitting and registration, which is 3 million gallons per month. If it was above that, then we include it in the model. So there may be some withdrawals that are below that. In some instances, where there is a location where there's multiple withdrawals, but below that threshold, we decided to include them as an aggregated amount. But typically, we're focusing just on the withdrawals that have a significant impact to the river system.
Yeah, and the only other thing I wanted to point out is that really applies to any withdrawal that has a permit or registration associated with it, because there will be a permitted or registered amount, and then there will be an actual use amount. So that model can be run either way for any water use sector, not just agriculture.
Okay. How are historical unimpaired flows reconciled with more modern flows that will be higher due to increased development?
If I understand the question correctly, it has to do with the variability in impairment level through time, and how these flows have been increasingly impaired, if you will, as you move through time. Because we have such a long record in the model, and we'll be extending these records of flow for each gauge, and effectively taking them back to the 20s and 30s. We'll have 80 years of record for each point in the basin that we want to evaluate. And the trends in land use and the trends in water management over that 80-year period will be evidenced in those flows as we see them. But effectively, the unimpaired flows will represent what the natural hydrology would have been in the basin for that 80-year period. And the changes in patterns sort of get added and subtracted back out of that to get the unimpairment. And I hope I understood the question correctly.
I think that was it.
Okay, here's a double doozy for you. Does the model estimate withdrawal amounts that are not meeting the threshold for water usage reporting under state law? And then there will be a second question, but try that one first.
I think that one speaks to my previous answers. If it's less than 3 million gallons per month, we typically have not included it in the model. It's not a matter of the model estimating withdrawals.
You're going to have to get closer again.
Excuse me. It's not really a matter of the model estimating withdrawal. It's whether we decide to implicitly include a withdrawal within the model. And our threshold, again, was typically 3 million gallons per month. So if you have a withdrawal that's only 1 million gallons per month, it's not going to be reflected in the model.
Okay. Here's the second doozy, and it's, I think, about 3 questions in one here. How is consumptive use of thermoelectric and agriculture accounted for in the model? In other words, how to calculate water return as less than water withdrawal? Is there a general percentage of water something for each user category? Sorry, I can't make that up.
So luckily we have some specific information that helps us estimate what the consumptive use is for individual users, and then we can kind of make some generalizations for different water categories. So for like thermoelectric use, DHEC was the starting point for collecting data. They have both withdrawal and discharge data that's reported to them. We also supplemented that by contacting, and will contact in other basins, the power producers, SCE&G and Duke, and they have additional records, typically which predate DHEC's records. So between those two data sets, we can come up with a good estimate of the consumptive use of the power plants. On the agricultural side, our initial assumption is that there's 100% consumptive use, meaning that there's no return of agricultural withdrawals, that everybody's irrigating efficiently, they're not over-irrigating. That's not necessarily what we've assumed in out west, for instance. I think we've assumed up to sometimes 30% or so of returns. So that's actually a question that we've kind of posed to some folks at Clemson, and we're going to look into. And it may be a calibration parameter. We may decide that, there are some returns going on in agriculture that we need to include in the model. And basically, it's a knob that we can turn in the model and account for some return flows.
And we'll be able to get a good handle on that by looking at some sub-basin tributaries where the only use or the dominant use is agriculture, and looking back at historical records and determining how much of that flow made it back into the river.
Next question. Will the model take into account the needs of recreational users?
And if recreational needs dictate a certain flow, we can experiment with putting a requirement to maintain that flow level in the model using that element. So there are tools within the model to look at maintaining flows or water levels for whatever the purpose may be, whether it's recreation or power generation or ecological needs. There are the tools in the model to do that.
Next question. How do you determine the flow of tributaries? In other words, the ones that don't have stream gauges, where you don't have stream gauge data, how do you determine the flow of creeks and tributaries?
I should have stayed up.
You should, but you'll get exercise. It's good for you.
That's one of the key uncertainties in any hydrologic study, is estimating flow where it's not measured. We're fortunate in this basin and throughout the state to have enough USGS gauges that we can find one that's similar in the subbasin, similar in size, similar in land use characteristics, similar in slope, that we can estimate the flow in basins that don't have gauges. Now, once we do that, and there are statistical ways to do that, we'll go back and check. And that's part of the calibration process. That we'll take the basins that have the gauges, the basins that don't, add them all together, and as they come together into a main stem of the stream in the network, they should add up to the flow at a gauge downstream. So the good ways to check that, but basically it's applying statistical methods of hydrology to estimate flow where we don't know it from places that are very similar and we do know.
Okay. Is the model set up to distinguish between different types of irrigation used in agriculture? Or is there only one type of irrigation in South Carolina?
The important thing to the model is the withdrawal amount. Agriculture, like any other user, we're simulating an amount of withdrawal. I think, as Kirk showed in one of the input screens, we can also model agriculture based on what a demand might be, based on crop type and so forth. But ultimately, the model is using the water that you're pulling out of the system. How that gets applied to the ground really is not a component of the model. I'm not sure if that's answering the question.
I'll add one thing, that there are some options in the model to specify or calculate, estimate the agricultural need based on percentage of acres that are planted with certain different types of crops. And there is a value there that lets you adjust the irrigation efficiency. And so there can be some calculations internal to the model that can account for that kind of variability.
Okay, in the model, is flow versus ocean salinity impacted in any way?
No.
That was the easiest one today. Okay. Will groundwater withdrawals be taken into account when considering surface water availability? And how is the study used to address safe yield?
Groundwater is not modeled or tracked explicitly in this tool the way it would be in a groundwater simulation model. As Ken mentioned, there will be a separate phase of this study that does look explicitly at groundwater. Now, with that said, if there are withdrawals from the groundwater, we will account for that. That'll be water that's made available to the basin by its return flow. If there's water taken from the ground and used, and a portion of that is returned to the basin, we will account for that. It would effectively, mathematically, it would be the same thing as an interbasin transfer. It's water that doesn't originate in the surface water of a basin, but is discharged back into the surface water of that basin. And so we would account for it that way. In terms of safe yield, what the model will be used for, or can be used for, is to determine, we showed a graph of this sort of in passing, determine how frequently you can expect to see flows at any given level. If it's a reservoir, we can tweak the rules and determine how much is fully sustainable at any given withdrawal rate. If it's a riverine withdrawal, we can use the tool to help explain under these conditions, under these use conditions, this is how frequently you can expect to see flow of X, the flow of Y, the flow of Z, and that sort of thing. So if you're curious about how often a certain flow threshold would be available, the model will be able to calculate that.
Are the slides used today available online? If not, can they be? The answer is yes. We will put all these slideshows will be on the scwatermodels.com website, and they also might be on the DNR website, because the DNR also has another website dealing with this state water assessment. So I think you can find them in both locations. Oh, as well as the iClicker results will be on there also. Okay. Are more water flow gauges needed for this type of modeling?
I'll put in a plug for our friends at the USGS. And as a hydrogeologist, more data is always better than less. And so you can't have too much data. As I said, we are blessed with a pretty good stream gauge station throughout the state, but there can always be more. And I think they're looking for donations at the USGS for partnerships to help fund those stations. So one of the things that we've actually asked CDM to look for as they go through the modeling process are to identify areas where a gauge station would be really, really helpful. And so we might come out of this process with a list where we could really improve our overall gauge network with some very specific recommendations and locations.
So David, you might want to stay standing up, because here's a very related question. Are there private landowner installed gauges that will be or could be used to collect data for the modeling?
Yeah, I think you could talk to the USGS about that. They partner with different companies, municipalities all the time on their stream gauge network. It certainly has to, just like if we were to accept water quality data, it has to be done to a certain standard. The USGS operates in the same way, but you can probably see anybody with a USGS shirt on and ask them if you're interested in that sort of partnership.
I've got two cards here on groundwater, and they're very similar, so I'm going to try to summarize these. And they essentially ask, is groundwater data going to be used in the model because groundwater and surface water are intricately linked in the Edisto Basin?
I've already answered that one, but
yeah, not explicitly. Again, this is a surface water model. We do recognize that in the Edisto and other basins, groundwater withdrawals that are more superficial can impact surface water. So that may be something during calibration we have to recognize, kind of understand a little better, and figure out if the groundwater withdrawals are in fact what's causing our surface water portion of the model not to balance, perhaps. So it's a consideration, but generally no, the models keep separate from groundwater. That said, we do have a aquifer object in the model, which if we include a groundwater source, it'll do a kind of very simple type of calculation to depict drawdown in the aquifer. There may be applications where we can use that, perhaps in the Edisto, to look at drawdown of more superficial aquifers.
The one thing I'll add to that is that there's a function in the model in basins like this or in reaches like this where we know that water may be lost from the stream to groundwater, to include that explicitly and use that as a calibration parameter, sort of a loss rate as water moves down a specific reach. That can be calibrated very easily in the model.
Will the model help provide recommendations for legislation, and specifically recommendations for changing the Surface Water Permitting Act?
I think the job of the model is to provide good information. We certainly can't speak with what the legislature may or may not do, but as mentioned before, these models help inform the process, provide a good basis for evaluation, and I think that's the job these models are intended to do.
With that begs the question, what will you recommend?
I don't know until the models are run.
Oh,
So you will make recommendations off the model.
I didn't say that. We can have a separate conversation later if you want to.
Okay. Now this question you may have already answered, and I might have been busy looking at other questions. This one is, will this analysis address safe yield?
Yeah, I think you already answered that.
Yeah, I touched on that a minute ago. What it will do is provide information on any given flow threshold. If you're talking about a riverine withdrawal, not a withdrawal from storage, it will provide output in the context of how frequently will any flow threshold be available for use. And that would be the way that type of thing would be addressed in the model. If it's a reservoir, it can calculate the firm yield of the reservoir. If it's a riverine withdrawal, the question is how frequently would any given volume of water be available.
Okay. Now, I do realize it is 4 o'clock. We said this meeting would go from 2 to 4. But I still have 15 or so questions left. And we will stay and go through these questions if people would like us to do that. All right. We will keep going then with the questions. Okay. What about interbasin transfers of wastewater? For example, Batesburg-Leesville tried to dig a channel for sewage water into the Edisto. Also, agricultural discharges into the Edisto.
Yeah, so we do include any interbasin transfer, whether it's bringing water in and discharging it as wastewater or sending it out to another basin. So it's an input into one model and an output into another model, perhaps. So those are accounted for, and it can be simulated as a planning simulation as well. We can look into the future to evaluate the impacts of interbasin transfers.
At what point with the model is the flow information matched up with the needs for fish and wildlife?
One of the objects that you can include in the model that Kirk mentioned, which we actually didn't show on the SWAM representation framework, is a in-stream flow object. It's a little circle with a fish on it. We can place that object anywhere we want to in the model to look at ecological flow requirements and evaluate them. So evaluate flow in that river during different conditions compared to what is the needed ecological flow. So that's one, I think, very useful tool that can be pretty much done anywhere throughout the system. Just have to add that object and include it in there and then kind of evaluate it that way.
Okay, this one has some names in it. I'm not going to name any names here. But it says the waterfalls on the South Fork of the Edisto are dry 4 out of 10 summers. How does the model factor in droughts?
Historic, right?
The 80 years of data that go into the model cover a broad range of hydrologic and climate conditions, including some of the most severe droughts the state has seen in the period of record, as well as periods of plenty. And it's with that full range of conditions in the periods of record that are going to be embedded in this model that we'll get a sense of how this system can respond to significant droughts. And maybe more importantly, how frequently these droughts are likely to occur and affect the availability of water. The value of using long records is that you start to get a sense of the statistical probability of certain flow levels or lack of flow. And that's one of the real values in having a tool like this and making decisions. There's nothing certain about water planning, but if you can start to wrap your mind around how probable certain conditions are likely to be, good decisions can be made on that information.
Okay. Will the model be open to use by the public through the internet site, through the scwatermodels.com internet site? For example, will a landowner be able to input information directly into the model through the website?
What's envisioned is for the models to be perhaps downloadable. We might have a separate site where people can go to download the model. We're still working through a little bit of the logistics on system security and everything that we have to do to in today's modern era of hacking into accounts and that sort of thing to make sure that it's secure. But it's envisioned that when the models are done, they'll certainly be available for people to use. As new users come on and off the system, we'll have those records and we can adjust the model in that way as we go. But certainly they'll be available for use, and we'll provide training at the end of the process for those that want to get trained in how to use them.
Okay. Are all of the ag sites listed currently in the model, or just the ag sites that are permitted?
Yeah, just the registered ag sites are now included in the model. If they weren't large enough, or the withdrawal wasn't big enough to have a registration, then they're not included.
Okay. Are more resources already identified to complete the SWAM model?
I guess it's a question speaking to, do we have all the data we need to build the model for the Edisto?
It says resources.
Resources. Yeah, I think so. In terms of the data, we're pretty much finished with collecting everything we need for the Edisto. Now it's just a matter of compiling that all, building the model, and the tedious part, the most time-consuming part, is developing the unimpaired flow data set. But I believe, to answer the resources in general, we're good to go.
Will you supply some measure of, like some kind of correlation coefficient of the model versus historical actuals, i.e. some measure of the model's accuracy?
Yes, we will do that. We'll provide a number of statistical measures on the model accuracy. Again, as I mentioned, the model works on a daily and a monthly time step, and we'll be looking at both of those, the accuracy on both of those scales, as well as annual. How often are we meeting the annual volume of water? But we'll provide information on correlation coefficients. We'll provide comparative averages on a monthly basis, as well as just traces, graphs that you can see. My personal belief is one of the most important things about a model is to make sure it captures the dynamic response patterns of the actual system. Does the flow draw down at the right rate and pace and stay down for the right duration, and does it recover at the same way we've seen it historically? And those can't always be captured with statistics, but they can be captured with visual inspection of these graphs. So a combination of good statistics and visual inspection of those two trends will be the key to validating these models.
Okay, when evaluating the impact of a new water withdrawal permit, can the model evaluate the impact for a wet year versus a dry year, and for a winter month versus a fall month?
Yes. The simple answer is yes. We'll have 80 years of record in the model, and you can run 1 month if you'd like to, or you can run 1 year if you'd like to, or you can run the entire 80-year period of record. So whatever period you'd like to focus on, whatever condition you'd like to focus on, the model will let you do that.
Will the stakeholders have a seat at the table in final determinations, and I assume recommendations of the model?
I think that's... I don't know if you're talking about the planning piece or the model final.
Recommendations of the planning piece.
Yeah, I think so. I think they're talking about the planning piece, Ken, rather than the model final.
Well, stakeholder input will be accounted for in the models. They've already done that some in the Saluda, but when we get into the next phases and the Basin Advisory Councils, for instance, there'll be plenty of opportunity for stakeholders to make input on policy recommendations and that kind of thing. So there will be opportunities down the road for sure.
I'll just add, prior to the second meeting we'll have here in the Edisto and all the other basins, we will have posted a modeling report, which basically describes the model development, the data that went into it, and then the calibration process. So you'll have the opportunity to look at the model to see how, if you're a withdrawer, how your withdrawal is represented, how the model calibrates, how it compares to historical conditions. You'll be able to see all that before we have the second meeting. So at the time we have the second meeting, then you can ask questions, you can point out something that you may think is incorrectly represented in the model, and that'll be the opportunity to provide feedback before we kind of put a final stamp on the model.
Okay, and I think we've hit this one from a couple different angles, but we'll hit it from another angle. How does the surface water model information get used in the agricultural withdrawal permitting process?
Well, I think it's the same answer, as before. These models will provide a lot of good information and different ways to evaluate whatever basin we're talking about, and that'll be provided, to the decision makers. So,
may I ask a follow-up there?
Quickly, yes.
Quickly, in Aiken, we were told that the only way that the ag registration was judged was on the safe yield calculation. Since the model is not part of the safe yield calculation, how does this information from this excellent study get into the decision maker?
Well, I think I'd say the same thing again, that these models are used to provide information to those who would make the decision. The safe yield calculation that's in the law is what stands today, is the way safe yield is calculated. Again, these models will help provide information to evaluate the basin dynamics, and that can be provided to the decision makers.
Okay, will the model affect any regulations of discharge from wastewater treatment facilities, and if so, how?
I think no is the simple answer there. Discharge permits are evaluated using different criteria, different models. You'll see this as a common theme. If you're evaluating groundwater in a very great amount of detail, you kind of need a separate groundwater model. If you're looking at water quality parameters, there's other models that are used for that, and that's really what is used for determining discharge permits.
But they will be included in the model.
Yeah, right, but the quantity will be obviously incorporated into the model.
Okay, this is the final question. Is this the scientific study our state representatives have been waiting for?
I'm not sure we can fully answer that question, but certainly this, as I said before, is our attempt to have a foundation in sound science to give those decision makers the proper tool to make those decisions. So I think it will go a long way to giving them the tool to help them make informed decisions. Yeah.
Okay.